An age of faith. Religion shaped life in the Middle Ages. In the countryside, the pealing of church bells was one of the few sounds that echoed over the quiet fields. Country roads carried the traffic of pilgrims and crusaders on their way to worship sacred relics or fight in a holy war. In this age of devotion, even the natural world looked very different. A rose, for example, was much more than just a beautiful flower. To the medieval mind, it might symbolize some spiritual truth. In the growing towns, too, the sights and sounds of faith were part of daily life. The streets were crowded with frequent processions, solemn lines of people walking to or from the churches. On holy days, in particular, the air smelled of incense and carried the sounds of religious chanting. Forms of devotion. Religion was so important in the Middle Ages that this period is sometimes called the Age of Faith. Throughout most of Western Europe, Roman Catholicism was the dominant form of Christianity. Christian Europe expressed its devotion to God through personal prayer and public worship. Religious orders. In early Christianity, monks and nuns pursued personal salvation through prayer and meditation. They lived in monasteries that were often set in remote spots, cut off from contact with the world. However, by the 1200s, monasteries played a more active role in the world. Monasteries were centers of agricultural production and owned large areas of land. Some monasteries were located in towns, where they provided education or charity to ordinary people. Also in the 1200s, new forms of Christian community emerged. For example, the mendicant orders were founded to fight heresy and to preach to ordinary people. The mendicants, or beggars, owned no property. Mendicants survived by begging for food and drink. St. Francis and St. Clare. One of the best-known mendicant orders was founded by St. Francis of Assisi. As a young man, Francis was rich and spoiled. Then he had a powerful religious experience. He felt called to live as simply as Jesus had lived. Francis believed that all nature was a reflection of God. Because of this, he felt compassion for all living things and referred to animals as his brothers and sisters. An account of his life written after 1228 tells this story. One day he came to a town called Alviano to preach the word of God. The people became quiet and waited reverently, but a flock of swallows continued to chatter away, making it impossible for the people to hear. Francis spoke to them. "My sisters, the swallows, it's my turn to speak now. Listen to the word of God. Stay still and be quiet until it's over." To the people's amazement, the little birds immediately stopped chattering and did not move until Francis had finished preaching. Thomas of Celano, First Life of St. Francis. Francis's pure and simple life of devotion attracted many followers. In 1209, he established the Franciscan order. Women were also attracted to the kind of life preached by St. Francis. In 1212, a noblewoman, later known as St. Clare of Assisi, founded an order based on the teachings of St. Francis. Clare and her followers took a vow of poverty and aimed to live a life of devotion to God. Their order became known as the Poor Clares and spread first through Italy and then across Europe. Reading check. What were the mendicant orders? Medieval religion and culture. Religion also had a great influence on the arts during the Middle Ages. The Church shaped cultural values and helped form codes of conduct. Revival of drama. Since the fall of Rome, the Church had disapproved of drama because of its association with the pre-Christian world. Eventually, however, the Church allowed plays based on stories from the Bible. These mystery plays marked the revival of European drama. New architecture. Religion also inspired some of the greatest architecture since ancient times. A new building style that came to be known as Gothic emerged. Gothic combined religious symbolism with engineering advances. Cathedrals built in the Gothic style were higher than any seen before in Western Europe. Gothic was a revolutionary new architecture. Earlier churches were dark and gloomy. They had massive walls, thick columns, and narrow windows. By the mid-1100s, building technology had advanced. European architects found a way of concentrating the weight of a roof on certain points in the wall. This meant that huge areas of wall could now be opened up. Windows could be larger, filling buildings with light. This architectural breakthrough allowed masons to build stone structures that were spacious and airy. Gothic churches first appeared in France, but they soon rose all over Europe. Rich townspeople funded their construction. The Gothic cathedral was a breathtaking sight. Rising high above the rooftops, it could be seen for miles. The church shapes chivalry. The church also influenced cultural values and social behavior. Medieval Europe was a place of almost constant conflict. In this violent world, a code of conduct known as chivalry helped control the behavior of knights. Some values of chivalry, such as bravery and loyalty to the king, were military and feudal in origin. However, the church tried to shape chivalry to reflect Christian values of generosity, humility, and mercy. Knights were expected to defend the church and to protect weaker members of society. While the conduct of knights was often far from chivalrous, the values of chivalry left a permanent mark on European manners. Reading check. What was the purpose of chivalry? The growth of learning. The High Middle Ages saw expansion not only in trade and culture, but also in education. Once again, the church influenced this growth of learning. Medieval universities. Students were trained for the priesthood at schools attached to the cathedrals. Gradually, schools were set up to provide further education. These grew into universities, schools or groups of schools that trained scholars at the highest levels. The medieval university was itself a kind of guild. Professors and students organized to form the university. Classes were held in rented rooms or in churches. Books were expensive and were often rented or shared by students. Despite these discomforts, there was a new excitement about learning. Many works of ancient Greece had been preserved in the Byzantine Empire and in Muslim lands, where they had been studied by Arabic scholars. Copies of these books traveled to Europe, along with Arabic books of science and philosophy. Such books were added to the monastery libraries, which had preserved other works of classical learning. Young men from all over Europe came to study at the universities of Bologna in Italy, Paris in France, and Oxford in England. They studied the liberal arts, subjects such as grammar and logic, meant to develop their powers of reasoning. Although these students spoke different languages, communication was not a problem. The church had preserved Latin as the language of learning. Students who spoke Latin could understand courses taught at any university. Thomas Aquinas. The universities attracted the best minds in Europe. One of the greatest medieval scholars was a professor at the University of Paris named Thomas Aquinas. He was deeply impressed by the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle had emphasized the use of human reason to discover knowledge. In contrast, many church scholars emphasized faith as the path to truth. Aquinas wanted to show that there is no conflict between the two. He argued that both faith and reason come from God. Aquinas believed in natural law. Unlike human-made law, natural law does not change over time or from one society to another. Aquinas believed that natural laws could be discovered through the power of human reason. An age of confidence. A growing confidence in human reason is one of the main features of the High Middle Ages. During this time, conditions in Europe improved dramatically. Towns grew, trade increased, and populations boomed. The universities created an educated class that helped run the church and state. Europe's growing prosperity influenced religious practices and attitudes. In art, painters began to show a more human Jesus, a Jesus who suffered like ordinary human beings. The desire to help humanity and to improve conditions in the world influenced the formation of the new mendicant orders. In the growing towns, soaring cathedrals expressed both the medieval devotion to God and a new confidence in human skills and abilities. Europeans felt great pride in these mighty symbols of faith and community. But even in these centuries of confidence, Europeans remembered an even more ancient symbol, the Wheel of Fortune. At one turn of the wheel, fortune could make you rich and powerful. But another turn, and the wheel could just as easily tumble you down into poverty and ruin. As the 1200s came to an end, there were signs that fortune's wheel was turning again. This time, it was spinning all Europe toward disaster. Reading check. How did universities develop?